Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a horror and thriller wrap up, and I'm happy to say that I am obsessed with the books in this video. I decided to take a trip down memory lane because, as a lot of you know, I've been struggling just really falling back in love with thrillers and horrors over the last year. I've been up and down and I've shared my whole journey with you all, and I decided to go back to my roots. So I thought about back to way at the beginning when I started my channel and even before. And the first adult thrillers that I really fell in love with were kidnapping fiction stories. And for whatever reason, I've always been fascinated by kidnapping narratives, and I just find them to be very compelling, very gripping, very immersive. And for whatever reason, I've just stopped reading them. I think I've stopped seeking them out, and so if they don't kind of show up on my doorstep or they aren't kind of in front of me as an option to read, I just haven't really been reaching for them. And I decided to change that, and I gotta say, it was a great adventure because I found several that I really enjoyed. I got completely obsessed, the kind of reading experience where you don't want to put a book down. I have some great recommendations for you all, as well as, don't worry, some horror. I got some horror as well. And all that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk horror, and I read A Black and Endless Sky by Lyons, and this is a book I received from Turner Publishing for review. This story follows siblings Jonah and Nell, who are going on a road trip. Jonah has recently divorced from their spouse, and their sister is helping them out, so they go on this road trip together to cross the country and get to the final place where he'll be living. However, along this road trip, they go through the American desert, and, well, something happens to Nell. She disappears, and when she comes back, she just does not seem like herself. This is a book that I went into not knowing a whole lot about it. It was one of those anticipated releases. It was labeled as horror, so I was naturally interested. And I will say that it kind of reads like a mashup of survival horror with a possible possession angle, which you know I enjoy. And so I, for the most part, liked this one, but I had a complicated reading experience, which I'll get into in a moment. So I will say off the bat, you meet these two characters, and the two characters, particularly Nell, are not necessarily likable. And I can read about unlikable people, but these people leaned into the side of being just annoying, and so it was a little bit frustrating to read off the bat. And I will say that the beginning of the story was quite slow, and so I will fully admit it took me a while to get into this book. In fact, if I had not been reading it as a review copy, there's a possibility I might have put it down because I do freely DNF or pause books that just aren't grabbing my attention. And because this one was a review copy, I was more compelled to keep going. But I will admit that the first half of the book, like literally 50% of it, I was just kind of reading along, going along for the story, and I didn't think I was gonna love it. But then the story took some really interesting twists and turns. There is a bit of an antagonist, villainous character that is introduced, and I thought that perspective was so fascinating, and suddenly I was cheering for the bad guy, and I don't know if I was supposed to, but I was. And I got really gripped into the second half of the story, and that never ever happens for me. Part of the reason I do tend to DNF quite freely these days is the fact that I've had a long history of reading, and it never ever happens that if I'm not enjoying the first half of the book, I go on and love the second half. This is probably the first time I can remember that actually working out and happening. So it was a really great surprise, and again, I'm really glad they stuck it out because I would actually recommend this book. It was definitely creepy. It did give me vibes of The Ritual and some of the survival aspects to it, but at the same time it was very different. I of course loved the possession possible aspects to the story, and it just got really good at the end. I thought the climax was fantastic. I was completely immersed in the second half and just flew through it. So this is the time that I will say that if you are trying this book, if you find the beginning a little bit slow, if you find the characters a little bit annoying and you kind of want them to die, well, stick it out because there is a fantastic character introduced later in the book, and the plot really gets going in the second half and is really worth the wait. So if you have the patience, I highly recommend sticking it out, finishing up this book, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I did because, like I said, despite my rocky start, I ended up really enjoying this one by the end and definitely want to check out more by this author. Then switching gears to thrillers, specifically kidnapping thrillers, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So the first book I want to talk about is Berlin Syndrome by Melanie Joosten. And this is a story that follows a tourist who is touring around Berlin, as you can guess from the title, and she meets a man, they hook up, and they spend the night together. However, when she goes to leave in the morning, she discovers that she cannot get out. At first she thinks that this is a mistake, he's just forgotten to leave her a key. However, as things go on, he However, as things go on, she realizes that he has locked her in the apartment and she is stuck there. This is a book that I picked up after watching the movie adaptation, which is available at least here in Canada on Netflix. So I'm gonna give a side recommendation for the movie because I got really obsessed and I might have watched it several times over the last few weeks. I basically have been watching it on repeat whenever I have a free moment. And so the movie follows a similar narrative. And so after falling in love with the movie, I was very excited to find out that it was based off of a book and went to read the source material. I will say that while I love the movie, I like the book, but not quite as much. And that's given the fact that there's a different focus. So for those of you that are familiar with the movie, I will say that it's quite scary. The perpetrator is really made out to be a predator. He is made to be scary, and you find out very early on that there is a cycle of this happening again and again, and he is possibly grooming his next victim. And so I found that the movie was just amped up. It had a lot more violence, a lot more threat of assault, and a lot just more happening. And so definitely more content warnings, but at the same time it made for a more scary, disturbing narrative. However, the book has a bit of a different focus, and I should know that given the title, because this book is definitely an exploration of the character study of Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim of a kidnapping becomes emotionally attached to the person that is holding them captive. And so this book really explores that. So you follow the story over a few different perspectives, a few different timelines, and so within the story you follow her when she first meets him and originally likes him, and then later on in her captivity. And you find out within the narrative that she is kind of becoming slowly more attached to him. Within the narrative, there are times where she potentially seems to have options to escape or to fight back, but she's not. And again, I think that the book just has a different focus, and so it's much more about seeing the experience through the victim's eyes and making the perpetrator a lot more relatable, or at least more sympathetic. And I didn't personally want that sympathy. I wanted him to be scary, and instead he came across as very naive and just kind of bumbling along. And if I'm honest, I wanted a more fierce predator. So overall, I would cautiously recommend the book. I did think it was interesting, but I would really recommend the movie because, like I said, I'm totally obsessed. I rarely get the chance to watch movies, especially on my own. And yeah, it's basically been on repeat. I love that story. It is so scary, and I'm completely obsessed. Can I say that enough? Next, I read Held by Adit Revell, and this is actually a young adult thriller following a teenage girl who is in Greece. She ends up getting captured by a group of men and held against her will. I normally don't reach for young adult thrillers when it comes to the genre, but I did make an exception here just because I do find it really hard to find the kind of thriller kidnapping stories that I'm looking for, so I decided to give this one a chance. I will say that it relatively read young, and because of the age that it is targeted at, this book didn't have as much threat of assault or violence as you would expect from something that is written for more of an adult audience. So what the story involves is the main character being held specifically by one man, and over the course of time he is taking care of her, he's preparing her food, and in a way keeping her safe from the other men that are holding her captive. And so it really does, like, once again set up that Stockholm Syndrome. And I think to a degree it felt believable, but to a degree it also started to turn into more of a romance story. And again, it was a very safe romance story because you never really had that full threat of sexual assault, which would be most likely something that it would be a larger concern if you were reading the story outside of a young adult context. So I thought this one had a lot of the pieces I liked. I would have preferred it to be more ramped up, more intense, but that's just my reading preferences. I did know I was going into a YA book, so I kind of got the story I expected. Enjoyed it. I thought it was decently well written, but definitely you have to be prepared and willing to read young adult in order to enjoy this one. From there, I turned to nonfiction and I read Hope, a Memoir of Survival by Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus. And this is a story that is co-written by two of the survivors of the Cleveland kidnapping, which, if you aren't familiar, is one where they found out that 3 women plus a child were being held captive in a man's house. And so this memoir is the story of 2 of the survivors of that incident. And so the story is told over dual perspectives. We get to hear from both Amanda and Gina as they are explaining how they got into that situation, what happened, and how they got out. I will say with a lot of the true crime memoirs I have read on these type of topics, especially when they surround women, is that there's a really strong theme of survival and resilience that is written into the narrative. I think it's just the way that these stories tend to be framed. And so while this book definitely has some really dark subject matter and content warnings, at the same time it is written with a glimmer of hope, as the title suggests, and is really meant to highlight the women and focus on them as victims and more so as survivors rather than glorify the man who did the kidnappings. I will say it was really fascinating. I was only vaguely familiar with the case beforehand. I think I was a little bit young when it all came out, so it was interesting to learn the details, and like I said, very horrifying. And in a good way, it was actually probably sobering for me, because while I have been obsessed with kidnapping thrillers, of course I've been reading fiction, and when you actually get to read the true accounts of the reality of what that actually looks like I said, it kind of sobered me up and kind of brought me back to reality and took me out of the romanticism and, you know, exciting, thrilling aspects of it, and really brought it down to the horrific incident that it is. And so I thought that this book was extremely compelling. I was gripped in and read it quite quickly. It's easily written. It's nothing fancy in terms of prose, but it does carry a strong narrative. It's easy to follow and easy to go through. And then if you are finished with that one, I highly recommend following it up with another book, and that is Finding Me by Michelle Knight, and this is the story of the third survivor. And she chose not to write the memoir with the other two, and then later on went and wrote her own memoir telling the story from her perspective. I think it's important because there were 3 women in the house, and that was my main complaint with the first book, is that I felt that they didn't really explain a lot about Michelle, and she was kind of in the background. I think they did that out of respect, that I assume she opted out of the original writing project. And so later on she gets to tell her own story, her own experience, and I thought that that was really interesting. She, unlike the other 2 women, come from a much harder background. She really was someone who was marginalized and really on the fringes of society in many ways, and dealt with her own abuse before going into the house. And so I really think it's a good memoir that really focuses on the fact that people who are already in marginalized situations are so much more at risk. And then on the flip side, you run into the issue that their cases, when they do go missing, are less prioritized from the press and the police, because they tend to see these cases as runaways and just assume that they left and just something terrible happened to them, and just don't show the same concern when it is a pretty young woman from a good family. And so I thought that this book was just a really interesting different perspective on the case, and really helped to round out the story and offer what I would say is a much darker and sadder narrative. So it definitely had huger content warnings. I feel like it was a lot more raw and a lot more honest as to the horrors that were happening in the house. So I do recommend, if you can handle the content warnings, if you've read the first one, I do think it's worth finishing it out by reading this other memoir just to get the full perspective. But yeah, it was a tough read, I gotta admit. Even for myself, it was tough. So that is it for this video. I would love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out, and also recommend me your favorite fictional thriller kidnapping stories, because while I have somewhat sobered up on this subgenre, I'm also still kind of fascinated, so you'll probably see a few more stories coming down the pipeline of reviews. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing if you enjoy thrillers, horror, true crime, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving me a thumbs up, dropping a little comment, even if it's just an emoji. And if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.